Welcome back. This is the second half of the World War II in Europe notes. If you haven't seen the first half, go back and click that link first. So we talked about the German Blitzkrieg. We talked about Pearl Harbor and the U.S. getting involved in the war. And now we are in it. The U.S. is involved. The U.S. has troops in Europe. They have stuff going on in the Pacific Ocean against Japan. We'll get to that next week. But for today, we're going to finish out this one. So the U.S. and England, they need to defend their fleets against German submarines. They have these the sort of this new threat. They had the U-boats in World War One, but they have really upped their game. The submarines are much more dangerous this time around. And the German submarines, they have decent success knocking out warships, but they have incredible success at knocking out our supply ships when we're trying to deliver food or guns or steel or coal to England. Those ships are getting sunk at a pretty alarming rate. And we don't have, England and the U.S. And what's left of the French military, don't have like a base in Europe. So we have to base our attacks out of England, and all we can really do is attack with our planes. And you can't hold territory with planes. All you can do is drop bombs and sort of weaken things enough to maybe you can land some troops there. So before we get to land any troops in Europe, we have to fly a lot of very, very dangerous fighter missions and bomber missions. And we had a lot of incredibly distinguished, Air Force units during the war. But the one I want to talk about, because, a lot of reasons, they're amazing. They had a huge effect on the war. They had a huge effect on the country after the war. And they tend to show up on the STAR test. Maybe not every year, but they tend to show up on the STAR test. And that's the Tuskegee Airmen. And this is an actual photograph of some of them planning out a mission, one of their bombing runs probably. And they were sort of an experiment by the Army to see if African Americans could serve in the Air Force. And the answer to that is obviously yes. Obviously African Americans can pilot planes. Obviously they can manage bombers. Obviously the answer is yes. And in 2021, obviously. But back in the 1940s, there were still a lot of those, I don't know another word for it, so a lot of those racist ideas were still around, that black people were somehow not as smart and capable as white people, which is obviously false. But that was a very common belief, especially among higher-ups in the military and most of American society, honestly. But there were enough people that wanted to try out these guys who really wanted to be in the Air Force, and so they put together an all-black unit. The Army is not yet integrated, right? It is a segregated Army. There are white units and there are black units. There are no mixed units in the Army in World War II, at least not officially. When the fighting got real bad in some places, you fought by who you had to fight by, but officially there weren't any integrated units. They were all segregated. And so the Tuskegee Airmen were the segregated black unit of the Air Force. And they ended up being incredibly effective. These guys were amazing pilots, accomplished some incredibly important missions for the military. And after World War II, when Dwight D. Eisenhower eventually gets elected president and has to fight, has to sort of put the Army back together after World War II to prepare for the wars of the 50s and 60s, he uses the Tuskegee Airmen as a big part of his reason why he's willing to integrate the armed forces. So, good job, Tuskegee Airmen. They deserve their place in the history book. I was really excited to find that photograph of them when I was putting this together. I think I found that last year, actually. Anyway, I was excited to find that photograph. And Vernon Baker, by the way, another name that comes up He was the first African American to earn a Medal of Honor for his service during World War II. And you can take a look at his Medal of Honor page on the military's website yourself. We'll take a quick look at it in class to kind of take a look at his story. But Vernon Baker was the first living African American to earn a Medal of Honor for his service. We eventually awarded some posthumous, some ones after African Americans had died that fought in earlier conflicts, but Vernon Baker was the first living African American to receive the award. And definitely deserved it. We'll talk about his story in class. So we can't get into Europe cleanly, so we have to do what we can, and one of the ways that we can is through some of the British sort of colonies in North Africa, and we're able to land some ships there, especially tanks. So November 1942, General Eisenhower and the British General Montgomery, they're able to attack the German forces in North Africa and push them back toward Italy. Because remember, the three big members of the Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan. So a combined British and American attack force is able to move the German troops out of North Africa, give us a route into Italy, which would give us a route into Europe to bring the fight to the Germans. This is where the big tank battles of World War II happen. There was definitely some tank battles during the Blitzkrieg, but they weren't like big battles between forces because the Germans were able to sort of rush in before anyone was ready. The tank battles in North Africa, however, are just incredibly, force versus force. It's a lot of tactics involved. General Patton was the U.S. general. General Rommel was the German general of most of these tank battles. Rommel had actually written a book on how to do tank warfare, and General Patton was a huge fan of that book. So it was a pretty wild thing. The movie Patton isn't 100% historically accurate, but it really captures the feel of what it was like, in the North Africa campaign, who General Patton was, what kind of a leader he was, and he'll pop up a couple more times in our history book. He does survive World War II. So by 1943, the Allies are invading Italy, and this is one of the things that sort of really drags on Hitler and the German army, because he has to take some of his troops from the fighting in Russia, where he's got to win. If he's gonna win this war, he has to bring troops away from Russia and down to defend Italy, which is it's what he had to do. He made probably the correct tactical choice, but the fact that he was forced to do that is a bit of a defeat for the Nazis, which is a good thing. It's a good thing when Nazis get defeated. So here is one picture of D-Day, the D-Day invasion. We'll talk about this in more detail in class. But if you want to hear General Eisenhower's speech leading into it, there's the link. And you can, if you go into your copy of the notes and click on it, you can click on it. Obviously, if you're watching on this YouTube, you can't really click on that. So the combined armies of the U.S., England, and what's left of the French army, who had escaped, in Dunkirk after the Blitzkrieg, they land on Normandy Beach. And this is what some of that, landing looks like. It's just boat after boat after boat in the water, and German defenses and trucks and tanks and, Zeppelins that were still in use in World War II. And 10,000 Allied troops were killed on the first day of fighting. These are World War I numbers. It's not trench warfare, but it is trying to run up a beach while Germans with machine guns are just shooting and throwing grenades and shooting missiles and it's terrifying. We're going to watch in class a short scene from Saving Private Ryan about this particular thing. And again, Saving Private Ryan, not 100% historically accurate, but pretty close. So this is a terrifying and risky maneuver but a necessary one. And another thing hopefully we'll have time to talk about in class. We tricked the Germans into thinking we were invading a different place, so they took most of their troops to defend a beach we weren't attacking. And one of the ways we convinced them was inflatable tanks. So that's not going to be on the test or anything, so that's more of an in-class discussion thing, but that's a pretty wild part of that story. I mean, honestly, you could take an entire class in an entire semester course in college on just the European theater of World War II. We're moving super fast through this. So again, if this is something you're really into, check out the resources section on your notebook for more reading and places to sort of start from. So I did want to take a minute to talk about the fate of these two tyrants. Mussolini and Hitler, they both are dead by the end of World War II. They died just a couple of days apart, really. Mussolini is trying to escape Italy. He gets out of Rome. I don't remember what town he ends up in, but while he's fleeing, somebody recognizes him. The crowd grabs him. They kill him. There's no trial or anything. They just murder him. And then they hang his body really high up over the village square, and I think his body was up there for a few weeks. I'm not going to show pictures of that in class, but pictures of that do exist, in case you're curious. But if that's not something you want to look at, like, don't. And then 2 days later, April 30th, 1945, Hitler is in a bunker in Berlin. The Russians are basically right outside the city, and he doesn't want to be taken alive, so he kills his girlfriend Eva Braun and then himself in a bunker. And from that point on, there's no leadership in Nazi Germany. No one knows who's in charge, so they end up having to surrender. So May 7th, so about a week after Mussolini is murdered and Hitler commits suicide, Germany surrenders unconditionally to the Allied forces in France, not to the Russian force. He wants to surrender to the French and the English because Germany thinks he'll get a better deal from them. And I mean, they end up having to surrender to both, and Germany gets cut in two, and we'll talk about that next unit. But Germany surrenders unconditionally. That means that they just say, we've lost, and whatever you're going to do, do it. We can't stop you. And so the top part of that image is the German officers that are still left alive, because Hitler's committed suicide and no one's sure exactly who's in charge. So they've decided they're the highest ranking people left, and they're the ones that are going to sign the surrender, and they do. And then the bottom picture are the Allied commanders, including Dwight D. Eisenhower right there, just to the right of center. Very distinct, very easy to distinguish, easy to recognize face, Dwight D. Eisenhower. You can kind of tell the different emotions of the different sides. Not very fun at all to lose a war. Pretty great feeling to end up winning a war. But we can't talk about World War II without talking about the Holocaust. There are a ton of pictures of Jewish people in terrible shape, dead or dying, and I mean, we'll end up seeing some of those before the end of this, but I did want to include one after a camp had been freed. I'm trying to remember which one this one. This might have been Dachau, which is the first camp that was freed by Allied forces. But it was definitely one of them. The Jewish prisoners have been freed. Clearly they're drinking some wine and just incredibly happy to not be in a death camp anymore. So April 29th, 1945, this is really late in the war. American troops liberate the concentration camp in Dachau. This is the first concentration camp that we had officially found. There had been rumors for years. There had been unsubstantiated, unverified reports for years during the war before this, but this is the first one that we officially find and liberate. And the death camps are just as bad as you think they are. This is where the gas chambers are. This is where the Jewish people are starved and worked to death. And if you end up too bad off to work anymore, then they take you to the gas chambers and execute you that way. And the soldiers, the U.S. soldiers that liberated the camp, they fought the few German guards that had been left there, took a bunch of them prisoner when they surrendered, and saw what was happening to these Jewish prisoners. And in this case, at least, they just executed the Nazi prisoners that they had taken, that had been the Nazi guards, because there wasn't a war crime trial here. It was just, we took you prisoner because you surrendered, but this is what you had done to the Jewish people all these years. So I think they just lined them up and gunned them down, which is not technically how the U.S. military is supposed to do something like that, but I don't know. I'm not going to judge them for it. So in the end, over 6 million Jewish people, homosexuals, people with physical or mental disabilities, the Roma, and more undesirable ethnicities like the Slavs, Eastern Europeans, were murdered by the Nazi regime. This is a genocide. Genocide is a word that was, basically invented to describe what had happened in this case. And a genocide is when you are trying to kill an entire people, an ethnic group or a religious group. And it's a lot. We'll talk more about it in class, including more about the Nuremberg trials. We'll talk pretty specifically about Adolf Eichmann. But what happened, after we gunned down the prisoners in the guards that we had taken prisoner in Dachau, we decided the rest of these people, the Nazi high command, the people who were in charge of these camps, we needed to put them on trial for what we called crimes against humanity. And one of the big things, and the thing, to sort of take away from a high school level history class on this, if you want to get more in detail on this, there are movies, there are documentaries, there's books, there's just a million things out there. There are entire college courses on the subject in philosophy and ethics and history. But as far as a high school level, class on this, the thing to sort of take away from the Nuremberg trials is that most of these Nazi officials, their defense, when they were brought up, there was a jury, there was a judge, there was a whole thing. And when they were brought up and they were offered to give their side of their story, they said, well, I was just following orders. It was these people that gave me the orders. They told me to kill them, so I just followed orders. And this ends up not being accepted by the judge or the jury at the Nuremberg trials as a valid defense. And a bunch of high-ranking Nazi officers are executed for their part in the Holocaust and other parts of World War II. And to this day, members of other countries' armies as well, like Germany's army, this is a huge thing in Germany's modern-day army, but since it's U.S. history. Members of the U.S. Armed Forces are taught they are duty-bound to ignore illegal orders. So if you're in the military and your commander gives you a legal, legitimate order, you better follow that order. That's very important. But if they tell you to execute prisoners, if they tell you to, gun down civilians, if they tell you to do obviously illegal things, it is your duty to ignore that order and report your superior for, ordering such a thing. Just following orders would not keep you out of trouble. And it certainly didn't keep these Nazis out of trouble, many of which were hanged for their crimes. I think there were a few firing squads, but I think most of them ended up being hanged. Oops, sorry. And that's it for the notes today. Sorry to end on the Holocaust and the Nuremberg trials, but we'll be talking about this in class tomorrow. We'll be going over this. If you have questions, if you have things you want to know bring those with you to class tomorrow, and then we'll get started on the war in the Pacific and island hopping, the Battle of Midway, Battle of Okinawa, having to use the nukes, Truman ordering the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. We'll talk about all that starting tomorrow. So have a good one. Bring your questions to class. Let me know if you need anything. And you did the dishes last time, so why not go pick up outside a little bit. Maybe you got a little porch area, maybe you got like a little yard area. I'm not saying you got to mow the lawn or anything, but go pick some stuff up. Go make it look a little bit nicer, a little bit neater. So have a good one. Take care. We will see you tomorrow.